March 22, 1945, the freezing wind rolled across the Rhine River as thousands of Allied soldiers waited for one of the biggest military operations of the Second World War. Maps had been studied for weeks, bridges had been prepared, artillery guns stood ready. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's massive assault was only hours away. Everything seemed set for history. Then,
if you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
hundreds of miles to the south, a completely different story began to unfold. A handful of American engineers quietly pushed boats toward the dark water. There were no grand announcements, no carefully planned ceremony, no waiting for permission to become famous. Before the sun rose again, one bold decision would leave the entire Allied command stunned. Within hours, a message would race through headquarters, forcing General Dwight D. Eisenhower to react to something nobody expected. The race to cross the Rhine had already been won before the official race had even started. The Rhine was more than just another river. For Germany, it was the last great natural barrier protecting the heart of the country. For years, German leaders had believed that any enemy trying to cross it would pay an unbearable price. The river was wide, fast, and difficult. In many places, steep banks made landings even harder. Bridges had been blown apart as German forces retreated east. Every experienced officer understood one simple truth. If the Allies crossed the Rhine in strength, the road into central Germany would open faster than anyone had imagined. By March 1945, Germany was collapsing from every direction. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. American, British, Canadian, and French armies pressed from the west. Fuel shortages crippled German armored divisions. Luftwaffe aircraft appeared less often. Factories struggled to replace destroyed equipment. Yet German soldiers defending the Rhine remained dangerous. They still possessed artillery, machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and enough determination to make every crossing costly. Only a few weeks earlier, on March 7th, soldiers from the U.S. First Army had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen before German engineers could destroy it completely. That unexpected victory shocked both the Germans and the Allies. Thousands of American troops crossed there, creating the first large bridgehead east of the Rhine. But farther north, another crossing was already being prepared on an even greater scale. Montgomery's Operation Plunder would involve hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of guns, and massive air support. It was designed to be the decisive crossing that would break Germany's remaining defenses. Montgomery believed in overwhelming preparation. Every bridge, every artillery position, every engineer unit, and every supply route had been carefully organized. His plan reflected years of experience. Nothing important would be left to chance. Once Operation Plunder began, German defenders would face one of the most powerful combined attacks of the entire war. Many Allied commanders expected it to become the defining operation of the final campaign in Europe. Far to the south, however, General George S. Patton had little interest in waiting for someone else's timetable. The commander of the U.S. Third Army had built his reputation on speed, surprise, and relentless pressure. Throughout the war in Europe, Patton had repeatedly pushed his troops forward faster than German commanders believed possible. His armored columns rarely gave the enemy time to recover. Even friendly headquarters sometimes struggled to predict where his lead units would be the next day. Patton understood something important about the final weeks of the war. Every hour mattered. German resistance was weakening, but it had not disappeared. If Allied armies paused too long, defenders could regroup behind rivers, establish stronger positions, and slow the advance. Speed itself had become a weapon. Patton believed hesitation often cost more lives than bold action. As March 22 came to an end, intelligence reports suggested that German defenses opposite the Third Army sector were weaker than expected. Prisoners described exhausted units with limited heavy equipment. Reconnaissance patrols noticed gaps between defensive positions. Air attacks had damaged roads leading to the river. None of this guaranteed success, but it suggested an opportunity. Patton immediately sensed what others might have overlooked. While enormous attention focused on Montgomery's coming operation, German commanders were concentrating resources farther north. The sector near Oppenheim appeared less heavily defended than many planners had assumed. If engineers could get infantry across quickly, surprise might accomplish what overwhelming firepower usually required. That evening, Patton met with senior officers of Major General Manton S. Eddy's She Corps. Plans were discussed quietly. Engineer battalions prepared assault boats. Infantry units from the 5th Infantry Division checked weapons one final time. Pontoon bridge equipment moved toward concealed assembly areas under darkness. Drivers covered headlights. Orders spread in low voices. The entire operation depended on remaining unnoticed until the first boats touched the eastern bank. Unlike Montgomery's carefully announced assault, Patton wanted confusion. He wanted German commanders wondering where the main attack would actually come. Every minute of surprise increased the chances that American soldiers would establish a bridgehead before enemy artillery could respond in full strength. As darkness covered the Rhine, the river itself became the greatest obstacle. Fast-moving water carried floating debris downstream. Engineers knew one mistake could overturn crowded assault boats before they reached the opposite bank. Soldiers checked life jackets, rifles, ammunition, grenades, and radios. Faces remained calm, but almost everyone understood the danger ahead. River crossings ranked among the most difficult operations in modern warfare. Troops were exposed with almost no cover. If defenders reacted quickly, casualties could become devastating. Shortly before midnight, the first American assault elements quietly approached the launch sites near Oppenheim. The only sounds were muffled footsteps, distant engines, and water moving against the riverbank. The darkness hid both opportunity and danger. German observers could be anywhere across the river. Then, the order finally came. The first boats slipped into the Rhine. American engineers pushed silently away from shore while infantrymen gripped their weapons. Nobody knew exactly what waited on the opposite bank. Every second felt longer than the last. The current pulled at the boats while paddles fought to keep them moving in formation. The eastern shore slowly grew larger through the darkness. Then gunfire suddenly shattered the silence. German machine guns opened from hidden positions overlooking parts of the riverbank. Tracer rounds streaked across the black water. American troops answered with rifles and light machine guns as boats continued toward shore. Mortar rounds exploded nearby, throwing water high into the air. Yet the German response was far weaker than many officers had feared. Within minutes, the first assault troops reached land. Instead of facing massive organized resistance, many American soldiers encountered scattered defenders who appeared surprised by the sudden attack. Small firefights erupted among trees, buildings, and defensive trenches overlooking the river. Squad leaders pushed inland before German forces could organize stronger counterattacks. Engineers immediately returned across the river for another wave of troops. Back on the western bank, more boats entered the water. The crossing quickly became a continuous flow of men and equipment. Engineers worked with incredible speed despite incoming fire. Damaged boats were repaired almost immediately. New crossing points were opened. Officers kept checking watches. Every successful trip increased the size of the bridgehead. Patton refused to remain behind the front. Throughout the operation, he stayed close enough to receive constant reports from forward commanders. Every new message confirmed that the gamble was working. German resistance remained scattered. American infantry continued expanding the bridgehead. Engineers prepared to assemble pontoon bridges before daylight if conditions allowed. Meanwhile, nearly 200 miles to the north, Montgomery's headquarters remained focused on the final preparations for Operation Plunder. Thousands of artillery pieces stood ready. Trucks carried ammunition throughout the night. Airborne units prepared for the coming assault. Staff officers checked schedules down to the minute. Everything remained organized according to plan. Yet history rarely follows a schedule. As midnight passed into the early hours of March 23, Patton's crossing gained momentum with surprising speed. More infantry reached the eastern bank. Anti-tank guns began moving across. Engineers searched for suitable locations to build heavier bridges capable of supporting Sherman tanks and supply vehicles. Every successful hour made German counterattacks less likely to force the Americans back into the river. Reports arriving from frontline units became increasingly encouraging. German defenders fought in isolated pockets rather than as one coordinated force. Several prisoners admitted they had not expected a major crossing in this sector. Others believed the main Allied effort would come farther north. That mistaken assumption had given Patton exactly what he wanted: precious time. Before sunrise, engineers achieved another remarkable milestone. Work began on floating bridges while combat continued nearby. Construction under enemy fire demanded extraordinary skill. Heavy pontoon sections had to be connected precisely despite current, darkness, and occasional shelling. Every completed section meant heavier equipment could soon reinforce the growing bridgehead. As dawn slowly revealed the river, American commanders could finally see what they had accomplished during the night. Instead of isolated landing parties trapped against the shoreline, they now held a steadily expanding position several miles deep in places. German artillery still fired intermittently, but the opportunity to destroy the crossing had already begun slipping away. Then came the message every headquarters wanted to hear. American forces had successfully crossed the Rhine south of Mainz. The report spread rapidly through Third Army headquarters before moving higher through the Allied chain of command. Telephone operators repeated the news. Radio stations transmitted coded updates. Staff officers hurried toward operations rooms carrying fresh situation maps. Somewhere farther north, officers preparing the largest planned river assault in Europe had no idea that another Allied army had quietly crossed first. And within Supreme Headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was about to receive news that would change the conversation surrounding the Rhine forever. As the morning of March 23, 1945, unfolded, reports from the front arrived one after another. Each update looked better than the last. More infantry had crossed safely. Engineers were making remarkable progress on pontoon bridges. Tanks and self-propelled artillery would soon be able to reinforce the bridgehead. German resistance remained determined in places, but it lacked the strength to throw the Americans back into the river. Patton's gamble had become a success before most senior Allied commanders even realized what had happened. Inside Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower studied the incoming situation reports with the calm expression that had become familiar throughout the war. As Supreme Commander, he carried a responsibility unlike any other officer in Europe. His job was not to make one army famous. His job was to defeat Germany while keeping the Allied coalition united. Every major decision had military and political consequences. Every victory had to be viewed through the larger picture. When Eisenhower learned that Patton had crossed the Rhine nearly 24 hours before Montgomery's Operation Plunder, he recognized the military value immediately. The crossing placed additional pressure on the already collapsing German defenses. Instead of concentrating against one Allied army, German commanders would now have to respond to multiple bridgeheads spread across a wide front. That complicated every defensive plan they still hoped to carry out. Patton, meanwhile, wasted no time celebrating. Celebration could wait until Germany surrendered. Speed remained his greatest weapon. Orders moved quickly through the Third Army. Expand the bridgehead. Secure nearby villages. Push reconnaissance units farther east. Bring armor across the river as soon as the bridges could carry the weight. Every hour increased the distance between American spearheads and the Rhine itself. The farther they advanced, the harder it became for German forces to organize an effective counterattack. Combat engineers worked almost without rest, floating bridge sections locked together one by one, while trucks lined up on the western bank waiting for permission to cross. Drivers watched the engineers with quiet respect. Everyone understood that without these bridges, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and tanks would remain trapped on the wrong side of the river. Engineers often received little attention compared to armored divisions, yet, on days like this, they decided whether an offensive lived or died. As daylight strengthened, German artillery attempted to disrupt the crossings. Shells exploded near the bridges, sending water high into the air. Some bridge sections suffered damage and had to be repaired immediately. Engineers returned to work again and again, often under fire, refusing to allow the flow of supplies to stop. Their determination ensured that Patton's bridgehead grew stronger with every passing hour. Farther north, Montgomery's Operation Plunder finally began during the evening of March 23. The scale was breathtaking. Thousands of artillery pieces fired in one of the largest bombardments of the Western Front. Allied aircraft attacked German positions across a wide area. Assault boats crossed the Rhine while engineers built bridges behind them. Soon afterward, Operation Varsity dropped thousands of airborne troops east of the river to support the advance. It was an impressive display of planning, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. Yet military history often remembers timing as much as size. Before Montgomery's massive operation had begun, Patton had already proved that the Rhine could be crossed by combining surprise, speed, and aggressive leadership. The achievement did not reduce the importance of Operation Plunder, which successfully carried British and Canadian forces deep into Germany. Instead, it showed that different commanders could reach the same objective through very different methods. Many people later wondered whether Patton had intentionally tried to beat Montgomery across the Rhine. Those who knew Patton understood his competitive nature. He respected bold action and disliked unnecessary delay. Whether he saw the crossing as a race or simply as another opportunity to keep pressure on Germany, his actions reflected the philosophy that had guided him throughout the campaign. If the enemy gave you an opening, you moved immediately. One story from the crossing became legendary. After reaching the eastern bank, Patton reportedly paused beside the river and relieved himself into the Rhine. It was a deeply personal gesture that reflected his confidence and his colorful personality. He later wrote proudly that he had long wanted to do exactly that. It was not an official military act, but it perfectly captured the character of a commander who rarely hid what he thought. The news of Patton's success inevitably fueled comparisons between the two Allied commanders. Montgomery favored deliberate planning, careful preparation, and overwhelming resources before launching major attacks. Patton believed that speed itself could create opportunities that detailed planning might never find. Both approaches produced victories during the war. Both commanders earned the respect of their soldiers. But they also shared a rivalry that became impossible to ignore whenever their armies achieved major successes. Eisenhower understood that rivalry better than anyone. He knew both men possessed extraordinary military ability. He also knew that allowing personal competition to damage Allied cooperation would only help Germany. His response reflected that larger responsibility. Rather than turning Patton's crossing into a public contest, Eisenhower praised the success while continuing to support Montgomery's planned offensive. His focus remained exactly where it had always been, defeating Germany as quickly as possible. In private, Eisenhower appreciated what Patton had accomplished. The unexpected crossing increased pressure along the entire Western Front. German commanders now faced attacks from multiple directions, with shrinking reserves and collapsing communications. Every new bridgehead forced them to divide already exhausted units. Every mile gained by Allied forces reduced Germany's ability to organize a final defensive line. The effect became visible within days. American armored columns pushed rapidly into central Germany. British and Canadian forces expanded their own bridgeheads after Operation Plunder. Town after town fell into Allied hands. German transportation networks crumbled under constant air attacks and advancing ground forces. Fuel shortages became even more severe. Many formations could no longer move effectively even when orders arrived. For ordinary soldiers, the crossing of the Rhine marked something emotional as well as strategic. Many had fought across North Africa, Sicily, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany itself. They had endured freezing winters, artillery barrages, and the loss of close friends. Standing east of the Rhine, they sensed that the end of the war in Europe was finally approaching. It was not over yet. Dangerous fighting still lay ahead. But the final chapter had clearly begun. German morale suffered another heavy blow. The Rhine had long carried enormous symbolic importance. Its crossing showed that no natural barrier remained capable of stopping the Allied advance. Civilians inside Germany watched Allied armies move deeper into the country with growing uncertainty. Military leaders struggled to coordinate defenses while facing attacks from both east and west. The strategic situation had become almost impossible. Within weeks, Allied forces surrounded the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. Hundreds of thousands of German troops became trapped inside what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. Their capture destroyed one of Germany's last major fighting forces in the West. The momentum created by the Rhine crossings continued without pause. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The fighting in Europe officially ended the following day. Looking back, historians would identify many turning points that led to victory. Among them stood those tense hours beside the Rhine when one commander refused to wait. Patton's crossing was never just about arriving first. It demonstrated the value of initiative, confidence, and recognizing opportunity before it disappeared. Montgomery's operation showed the immense power of detailed planning and coordinated force. Eisenhower's leadership showed something equally important. Great commanders do not allow personal rivalry to distract from the mission. They recognize success wherever it appears and use it to achieve the larger objective. Today, when people remember the race to the Rhine, they often ask what Eisenhower said after learning that Patton had crossed ahead of schedule. The exact words matter less than the decision behind them. He chose not to turn victory into a contest between personalities. Instead, he treated every successful crossing as another step toward ending the war. That quiet judgment revealed why he remained the right man to command an alliance made up of powerful generals with very different styles. Imagine the cold wind blowing across the Rhine as engineers tightened the final bridge sections and long columns of American vehicles rolled east. Behind every truck stood weeks of planning. Behind every bridge stood exhausted engineers. Behind every advance stood soldiers who understood the danger but crossed anyway. And above them all stood leaders making decisions that shaped history in real time. 24 hours may seem like a small difference on a calendar. In war, those 24 hours changed headlines, fueled one of history's greatest military rivalries, and proved that bold action could alter the course of an entire campaign. Long before the guns fell silent across Europe, the race to the Rhine had already become a lasting lesson in leadership, courage, and the relentless drive to seize the moment before it was gone.